A Bloodbath in the Border Princes, Part 5 Desperate Measures. War boss Gozot Gitsaba sat impassively on his throne. It was a curious thing, fashioned from bones and hides, and even some silk. But then again, he was a curious orc. He was the war boss of a growing force of orcs in the Badlands, and imposed his will on an ever larger collection of orcs and goblins. Curiously, he made his followers refer to him as the Salt Orc. He wore silks and clothes popular in the Arabian South, and next to his throne sat a massive curved blade he called the Kilatar. Rumors abounded amongst the boys as to how and where the Salt Orc had developed his strange habits, including, of course, drinking a leaf water called tea. None, of course, spoke within earshot of the Salt Orc, for his skill with that blade was equal to his reputation. Today, Gozok sat on his throne, awaiting a report from a very nervous-looking goblin called Giblet.
"The Humies got away, boss. The caravans are wise to our ambushes. They got away before we could chase them."
He instinctively ducked down, shying away from the huge sword that never fell. Instead, the Salt Orc rubbed his jaw with his meaty palm. He seemed to be thinking.
"Find Uzog. Tell him to take the boats and go across the sea. Raid the nearest Humie town and bring me all the gubbins. If we can't get the gubbins on the road, we'll get 'em into town."
Before Gozok could change his mind, Giblet ran from the makeshift throne to relay the order. No doubt he would make sure to indicate that he was to be left behind, and thus to save himself in the event that the humans put up a fight. Ernesto found Magnus shaving when he entered into his tent. As was his custom, Magnus awoke early and prepared himself for the day. Had Ernesto not been quicker, he would have had to search for Magnus in the training yard with some of the unluckier men-at-arms. Catching him at the right time, he brought the plate of food over to the table and placed it down carefully along with the letter. Things had taken a dire turn for the Compagnia del Corvo. Magnus had originally arrived in the Border Princes after frustration with a previous client in Talea. The company needed time away from Talea for things to settle, and Magnus believed that in order to retain their fighting edge, the company would be better off finding employment in a more dangerous part of the world. There were always merchants and nobles in the Border Princes, whose wealth needed defending, for a price, of course. Unlike in Talea, where a mercenary might spend his whole career battling other mercenaries, the Border Princes provided all manner of fierce opponent for anyone brave enough to try, and certainly they were brave. However, when they arrived in the city of Myrmidons, the company found a much colder reception. Magnus's chancellors had been unable to find any suitable employment. Those who wanted the Compagnia to fight for them had no means to pay for them, and those with the means to pay had no desire to employ new mercenaries. For several weeks they had remained in Myrmidons, their coffers slowly depleting until Magnus had to take drastic action. The city, for whatever reason, proved unwilling to provide for them, so the Compagnia would have to move elsewhere. Rather than take the expensive trek by foot, Magnus arranged with the ship captain for a ship to drop them off at Matoria, a port famed for its salt, further up north. From there, it would only be a short trip until they reached Barak Var, where the richer dwarfs might have need of strong sword arms. They were preparing to go to Barak Var that very day.
"You should look at this letter. I believe our plans are about to change."
Magnus stopped his task and turned to the older man, who merely gestured at the letter. Playing along, Magnus went and looked upon the letter. It was hastily written. "This is an employment contract, then?" he said quizzically. Ernesto nodded. "The burghers of Matoria believe an orc raiding party is coming to attack the city, and they wish to hire some experienced mercenaries to see to their defenses." Magnus grew more astonished as he read, "Expenses to be paid in full, along with a sizable gold bounty for defending the city?" In that moment, Magnus seemed giddy. The plate of food sat untouched. It was a sign of how dire their financial situation had been that Ernesto was only able to bring a small loaf of bread with a few pieces of cheese. Rumors abounded in the camp of the possible end of the company brought about by their latest captain. This was their chance. This was his chance. "Ernesto, you... No, I'll scratch that. I'll tell them myself. I need to inspect the defenses if we're to save this place." The Compagnia del Corvo raised themselves at the port's eastern gate. The orcs, never the best sailors, had blundered into some fishermen who rushed to warn the city of the impending attack. Rather than sail directly into the port, the orcs had landed some distance away and rushed to assault their city. Owing to trade disputes, Matoria found itself undermanned. Worse still, sabotage had jammed the gate open on the eastern side. An inquiry would later be launched to find out who had done it, although results would be inconclusive, and it would not be fixed in time for the assault. The burghers were about to send for mercenaries from Baragvar when the Compagnia del Corvo appeared to almost answer their prayers. The Compagnia took up a defensive position along the eastern gateway. The company's foot, a unit of halberdiers and pikemen, formed up near and in the gateway to the city itself. A unit of arquebusiers, eagerly holding slow match and preparing powder, manned the top of the gateway. Magnus stood, hefting a halberd and sword, outside the gateway, with his body of men-at-arms. The remaining forces, pistoliers and mounted crossbowmen, flanked them. Magnus had a plan. It would remain to be seen if he could execute it. The orcs opposing them consisted of a mixed assortment of orc boys, some with swords, a few with bows. 2 units stood out though. One unit of large orcs on fierce boars took up the center, alongside a unit of impressively armored orcs with the boss of the army. Their plan was simple. The heaviest orc units would simply batter their way through the gate while the rest remained to overwhelm the defenders outside. The orcs, eager to start, had the initiative, but failed to use it. Despite the threats from the war boss, many of the orc units began to squabble amongst themselves, and only a few units began to move as ordered. In response, the Compagnia's pistoliers moved forward and began firing their pistols and skirmishing. They would do minor damage to a mob of orcs, but they would keep them busy. Their counterpart, the mounted crossbowmen, failed to land any hits on the opposing orc units. Magnus had intended the light cavalry to disrupt the formation of orcs, and they had been partially successful, with the pistoliers holding up the left flank. Between the pistoliers and the arquebusiers, some damage had been done to the orcs with the lead shot. Not enough, unfortunately. Captain Koningsmark, leader of the pistoliers, had been stunned by an errant orc arrow. His armor saved him, but his unit had been halted. In that moment, one of the wilder orc mobs charged them down, cutting down a few and scattering the rest. They would have no further part to play in the battle. Despite this, most of the orc line still refused to move, except for the war boss, who grew ever more frustrated with his underlings' failure. Seeing a chance, Magnus ordered the foot to move forward to engage the warlord and his guards. In a rare display of bravery, Magnus went to face the warlord in single combat. The two fought furiously, Magnus's halberd against the orc's cleaver, but the fight proved inconclusive, and both sides retreated back to their bodyguard. This delay had been to the company's favor, as the warlord found himself charged by the halberdiers, pikemen, and Magnus's own men-at-arms. Despite this, the orc and his bodyguard fought tenaciously and only gave ground under the combined assault. In the end, this proved too much, and once the orc unit took sufficient casualties, the war boss and his remaining orcs panicked and fled, leaving Magnus and his soldiers in charge of the field.